Hello, everybody. Welcome to English 102 for this week. I hope everything is going well for you in modules 3 and 4. Before we start, just another reminder to please email me with your questions or drop into my drop in hours. I am still waiting on replies in the announcement in the poll. So please make sure that you go to the announcements page and put when would be a convenient time for you to have uh, drop in hours. And I'll be adjusting my time for drop-in hours starting on next week. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about integrating sources. This is something we do a lot in research writing. It's kind of the thing that we do the most. We go out and research and find sources, and then we use them in some way. So how do we use them? How do we engage with those other sources when we write? Now, there's three main ways in which we can do that, and they are analysis, evaluation, and synthesis. So we'll talk about what each one of these are, and then we'll look at an example of how we might do that with a source using a made-up fictional source. So the first way that we might take someone else's ideas and use them in our writing is what we call analysis. We use this word a lot in writing to mean a bunch of different things. But in this case, what we really mean is we're breaking down complex ideas into parts. We're studying those parts closely. And sometimes when those parts are maybe abstract or don't quite make sense, we might have to do a little bit of interpretation to say, this is what I'm looking at. This is what the source is. It really is describing what the source says. That's what analysis is. The second way that we use sources is evaluation. This is where we tell our opinion on them. We are talking about how strong of a source this is, or how good is their argument? Is it compelling? Is it convincing? We might be taking a stance on that source. And the third one that we use is synthesis, which is where we are combining multiple ideas or sources to say something new. This might be two different studies that we found that were done at different times by different people, but are about the same sort of thing. What did they both find? How do they compare? And what does that mean? Or maybe it's if you're in a literature class or a film class or a music class, something like along those lines, or even a social science class, you might have some sort of theory that you're applying to something that you're analyzing. So, in the case of literature, there's many schools of thought about how to interpret a piece of writing. So maybe you're looking at one particular way. Maybe you're studying post-structuralism in and reading a novel. So you're taking the ideas of post-structuralism and you're applying them to the novel. Where do you see them in the novel? How do they affect your reading of the novel? All these kinds of things. But what we're doing is taking these disparate ideas and putting them together to say something new. Sometimes the synthesis is, again, your own thoughts in conjunction with a source and being in conversation with that source to say something new, to describe something that hasn't been described before. So this is a lot of like kind of high level abstract description of what these things are. But what does that look like when we are actually looking at a source? So, like I said, I have a fictional example here that's made up. It's not a real source, but we're going to act like it is. And I've prepared some descriptions of this source using these three um, skills. So, what do analysis, evaluation, and synthesis look like in practice? So here we have a fictional source. I'm sorry, there's a I didn't realize that my text was cut off here. So hopefully you can read this. But the fictional source is an article titled "The Death of Cinema: How Streaming Killed the Movie Theater" by entertainment blogger Jake Morrison, published on Pop Culture Daily in 2023. Okay, so We've got an article, we got someone who wrote it, we got a publication date. Those are the kinds of information we need from a source. So, again, this one's fake, but we have those pieces of information here. So we were going to analyze this text. We might say something like this. Morrison argues that streaming services have fundamentally destroyed the movie theater industry by offering immediate home access to films and eliminating the exclusivity that once drove theatrical attendance. So see here, we're really just describing what is the argument of the source. This is what we do in analysis. We're describing, we're pulling out what's important. We're telling the audience what to think about this this source. But we're not really giving our opinion here. Sometimes, like I said, we might have to do some interpretation to kind of figure out what it's actually saying, but we're not really using our own thoughts here. If we start using our own thoughts when we do evaluation, right? This is where we're going to take a stance or somehow, evaluate, grade, or something like that of the source. So the evaluation might look something like this. While Morrison correctly identifies streaming as a disruptive force, his article relies heavily on anecdotal evidence and cherry-picked statistics from pandemic years, failing to acknowledge that many theaters have actually adapted successfully through premium experiences and that some genres still draw strong theatrical audiences. Okay, so here we're evaluating the source. We say, okay, this is what the source says, but here's the problem with it. It's not taking this into account. It's cherry-picked its statistics from a time where movie theaters were shut down, people were in lockdown, shelter in place. They weren't going to movie theaters, so this data actually doesn't tell us much. We can see different trends if we expand what data we're looking at. So we've taken a stance. This source is missing something. It's not the best source. It's not quite true. And here's synthesis, where we're going to take multiple things and put them in conversation. So it might look something like this. Combining Morrison's concerns about streaming disruption with more recent data on theater adaptation and audience preferences suggests that rather than a simple death of cinema, end quote, we're witnessing an evolution towards a tiered entertainment ecosystem where streaming serves convenience-focused viewing, while theaters pivot to experience-driven content that cannot be replicated at home. Okay, so here we're acknowledging other data. Again, this is fictional, so the data isn't in this sentence here, but we're referring to data that would exist that shows that theaters are adapting and that audiences are still going to them for certain things. So we're putting these two things in conversation with each other. Here's the thing that says that cinema's dead, the movie theater's dead. Here's the thing that says, hold on a second, that's not quite true. They're actually doing all right in when they do these things. This is what the data is actually telling us. So those are the kinds of things that you might do with your source. You might analyze it, you might evaluate it, or you might synthesize it with another source or your own thoughts. If you have questions about this, feel free to ask me, send me an email. But also look at the sample essays. They will show you what these things look like in practice from other student work. So you can use what you see there as a template to do it in your own paper. You can kind of steal what they've done and replicate it. So pay attention to those if you have questions or you're still not really sure what that looks like. We'll move off of that a little bit. I want to also talk about essay organization. This week you're going to start writing your introduction and turn it in before we meet next time. But what does an essay look like when you're talking about a research essay? Maybe you've taken English 101, or maybe you've written papers in high school and you kind of got a feel for what certain kind of essay might look like. But what does like a real serious research essay look like? What parts does it have? How is it organized? How do I figure out where my sources go? How do I how do I organize my ideas? So one thing is that if you've written other essays, research essays also contain pretty much all of the same parts. Sometimes they work a little differently, but it really follow the same patterns and have the same parts. So if you know how to write a different kind of essay, it's pretty easy for you to just turn that into research writing. You're still going to have an introduction. You're still going to have a conclusion. You're still going to have a body where you're making your arguments. You're giving your data. All of those things. The main difference here is that sometimes at the end of your introduction, where in other types of writing you would absolutely have to have your thesis statement. Sometimes a research paper doesn't actually state the thesis outright in the introduction. Sometimes the research question is used to say, this is what I'm looking at, and I'm going to show you the answer in the body of my essay. So it's a good idea to put your thesis in that introduction paragraph. That's still a really good place for it, and most essays will have it there. But sometimes the research question kind of takes its place at the end of the introduction before we get to the body. But when you do that, you have to make sure that you're really clear in your body, showing how this is answering that question that you raised in your introduction. And just like in another essay, a personal essay or anything, your conclusion is going to reiterate your thesis. If you only had your research question in the introduction, this is where you will definitely have to have your thesis. If you put your thesis in the intro paragraph, here you'll want to restate it, probably in some different words, so it doesn't feel too repetitive. But those things work pretty much the same in different kinds of essays in kind of Western writing. So if you've got a feel for like the 5-paragraph essay structure from high school, if you went through English 101 and felt pretty confident about writing essays and where things should go there, it's very similar. So don't think like you have to reinvent the wheel here and do it totally differently. Of course, there are differences and there are new skills that you're going to have to learn to use, but they're very similar. So the question is, in the body, how do you actually organize your ideas? Where should they go? So here are 3 kind of ways to think about how to organize your ideas. There are other ways, as always, but these are kind of 3 very, very, very standard, easy to understand, they work well kind of ways. So the first one is a story of research. This is basically you telling the audience, how did you go about answering your research question? In scientific research writing, maybe you had an experiment and you have to describe the methodology of your experiment. Think of that as kind of the same thing that you might do with a research essay. You have this question that you're looking at, and you're going through sources trying to find an answer. So usually the organizational method that you use here is chronological. First I looked here, then I found this source. I went digging further from in the sources from that source, and I found this other source. And here's what it said, etc. You've got like a chronological order to here's the sources, here's the ideas I came across, and at the end you come to your answer. The second method is what was just topical, to break it down into subtopics. When we do this, usually you'll have like subheadings in your essay. And so the question that you have to ask yourself here, once you've kind of figured out what are the subtopics, what are the little ideas that you're dividing your essay into, what order do they actually go in? Now you're not going to have a chronological order. So you may be like thinking, maybe I'll put the most important ones first, something like that. So there you'll have to think, if you do the topical method, you'll have to think hard about what order does it make sense, the most sense to put my ideas in. And then the third way is source-based, which is basically you've got a bunch of sources. You're going to spend a section of your essay or a paragraph at least devoted to each source. And then maybe you'll have some paragraphs at the end putting those sources kind of in conversation, saying how they work together, saying where they disagree, and figuring out what we can take from all of them. But those are the three ways, kind of a chronological history of your research, break it down into subtopics and figure out how to put those in an order that makes sense, or just going source by source through your essay. All three of these are good and solid ways to do it. All three of them can work well, but this is a decision that you have to make on your own. This is part of the writing process. You know, you've got your ideas, you've done your research, you've taken some notes, you've got some things kind of organized in your head, but actually putting it on the page in a way that makes sense is another step. So, you know, there's not like only one way to do this. Every essay is a little bit different. Every topic's a little different, and it makes sense to talk about different topics in different ways. So again, this is really the author has to think about this very carefully and choose one of these methods or some other organizational method that makes sense if you have one. You're not only limited to these. These are just good ones that are pretty simple to do. Now, if you need some help figuring out how to do that, I'm happy to help you. I'm not saying that no one can help you, but this isn't something that you can just read a book or an article online that will tell you how to do it. It really is a case-by-case basis, and it just takes some careful consideration to figure out which one to use. Or, again, is there some other way that you can think of that would be better? Sometimes there are. And when sometimes the best essays are done in a different way. They're really interesting because the author organized things in a way that works, is successful, is powerful, but maybe isn't really common or wasn't what the reader expected. So always feel free to try other things. I'm going to give you suggestions for things that might work for you, but you're not limited to that. And I want to encourage everyone to try things out of the box. That's how you grow as a writer. That's how you find your voice as a writer, is just trying new things and doing it over and over again.